In the mist-shrouded halls of Asgard, where the gods themselves walked among golden towers that pierced the very heavens, there began a prophecy so terrible that even Odin, the All-Father, would tremble at its implications. Tonight, we journey into the depths of Norse mythology to uncover the complete story of Fenrir, the monstrous wolf whose very existence would shake the foundations of the 9 realms and ultimately bring about the twilight of the gods themselves. Close your eyes and let your mind drift to a time when the world was young, when magic flowed through every forest and fjord, and when the line between mortal and divine was as thin as morning frost. This is not merely a tale of a wolf, but a story of fate and fear, of love twisted into betrayal, and of how the gods' own paranoia would forge the very weapon of their destruction. As we embark on this journey through the ancient Norse cosmos, allow the rhythmic cadence of this timeless saga to carry you gently into peaceful slumber. The story of Fenrir begins not with his birth, but with his father, the shape-shifting trickster god Loki. Among all the inhabitants of Asgard, none were more complex or contradictory than Loki, whose silver tongue could weave lies as easily as truth, whose cleverness had saved the gods countless times, yet whose nature would ultimately doom them all. Loki possessed the rare ability to change not only his appearance, but his very essence, transforming from male to female, from god to animal, from friend to foe, with the fluidity of water taking the shape of its container. During one of his many wanderings beyond the borders of Asgard, Loki encountered Angerboda, a powerful giantess whose name meant bringer of grief. She dwelt in the dark forests of Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, where ancient magic ran deeper than the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Angerboda possessed knowledge of satyr magic, the mysterious art of prophecy and transformation that even the gods held in wary respect. Her eyes held the depth of primordial wisdom, and her beauty was both terrible and magnificent, like a winter storm that brings both destruction and renewal. The attraction between Loki and Angerboda was immediate and intense, born from their shared understanding of the shadows that existed between order and chaos, where the other gods sought to maintain rigid structures and hierarchies. These two beings thrived in the liminal spaces, the twilight realms, where transformation was not only possible, but inevitable. Their union was passionate yet doomed, for it would produce offspring that would challenge the very foundations of the cosmic order. From this forbidden love came 3 children, each more terrifying to the gods than the last. The first was Jormungandr, the world serpent, whose coils would one day encircle Midgard itself. The second was Hel, half living and half corpse, who would rule over the realm of the dishonored dead. But it was the third child who would prove most dangerous of all, the one whose name would become synonymous with the end of everything the gods held dear. Fenrir was born as winter gripped the 9 realms with unusual ferocity, as if the very cosmos recognized that something momentous had entered existence. Unlike his siblings, who bore obvious marks of their otherworldly nature, Fenrir appeared as nothing more than a wolf pup, albeit one of unusual size and intelligence. His fur was the color of storm clouds, dark gray shot through with silver, and his eyes held an ancient wisdom that seemed far too old for such a young creature. The prophecies surrounding Loki's children had been whispered in the halls of Valhalla long before their births. spoken by the Norns themselves, the three sisters who wove the threads of fate at the base of Yggdrasil. The seers had warned that these three offspring would bring about Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle that would consume the 9 realms in fire and flood. Yet prophecies, as the gods would learn, are treacherous things, for the very act of trying to prevent them often ensures their fulfillment. When news of the children's birth reached Odin's ears, the Allfather found himself faced with an impossible choice. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, brought him detailed reports of the 3 young beings dwelling in the wilderness of Jotunheim. Thought and memory, as the ravens were known, had observed the children carefully, noting their rapid growth and the strange aura of power that surrounded them even in infancy. Odin's 8-legged steed Gleipnir carried him across the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost to consult with the wisest beings in all the 9 realms. He sought counsel from Mimir, the disembodied head whose wisdom came from drinking from the well of knowledge. He consulted the runes, casting them again and again, hoping to find some alternative path that might spare both his people and these innocent children. Yet every divination pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. These 3 beings would play crucial roles in the destruction of Asgard. The decision that Odin ultimately made would haunt him for the rest of his existence. Rather than attempting to destroy the children outright, which might have made enemies of powerful allies, and certainly would have violated the sacred laws of hospitality, he chose a different path. He would separate the siblings and attempt to control their development, hoping that by keeping them isolated from one another and from their parents, he might somehow alter their destinies. Jormungandr was cast into the vast ocean that surrounded Midgard, where the serpent would grow to enormous proportions, feeding on whales and sea monsters, until his body could encircle the entire world. Hel was banished to the realm of the dishonored dead, where she would rule over those who died of sickness, old age, or cowardice rather than in glorious battle. But Fenrir, perhaps because he seemed the most controllable of the 3, was brought to Asgard itself. The young wolf's arrival in the realm of the gods created an immediate stir among the divine inhabitants. Here was a creature of Jotunheim, born of the trickster Loki and the prophetic giantess Angerboda, yet he appeared as nothing more than an unusually large puppy. His playful demeanor and apparent innocence won over many of the gods, who found themselves charmed by his antics and impressed by his obvious intelligence. Only one among the Aesir showed no fear of the growing wolf, and that was Tyr, the god of war and justice. Tyr possessed a courage that was both legendary and absolute, tempered by a sense of honor that made him beloved among gods and mortals alike. He alone among the divine assembly volunteered to care for Fenrir, to feed him and train him, hoping perhaps that kindness and proper guidance might overcome the dark prophecies surrounding the young wolf. Under Tyr's patient tutelage, Fenrir flourished in ways that both delighted and alarmed the gods of Asgard. The wolf's intelligence became increasingly apparent as he learned to understand the complex language of the Aesir, though he never learned to speak it himself. His strength grew at an alarming rate, surpassing that of the strongest warriors in Valhalla, while he was still considered barely more than a pup. Most disturbing of all was his uncanny ability to sense deception, as if his hybrid nature granted him insights into the hidden motivations that drove even divine beings. The relationship between Tyr and Fenrir became one of the most remarkable friendships in all the 9 realms. The god of war, known for his serious demeanor and unwavering dedication to justice, found himself genuinely fond of the young wolf. Tyr would take Fenrir on long walks through the golden halls of Asgard, introducing him to the other gods and goddesses, sharing stories of great battles and heroic deeds, treating him not as a prisoner or a potential threat, but as a cherished companion. Fenrir, in turn, developed a deep loyalty to Tyr that transcended mere gratitude. The wolf seemed to understand that among all the gods who looked upon him with barely concealed fear or suspicion, Tyr alone saw him as an individual rather than simply the fulfillment of a dire prophecy. This bond became so strong that Fenrir would often refuse food from any hand other than Tyr's, and he would grow restless and anxious whenever the god of war was away on his various duties. Yet even as this friendship deepened, the other gods watched with growing unease. Fenrir's size increased dramatically with each passing season, until he stood as tall at the shoulder as a horse, his massive frame rippling with muscles that could crush stone. His teeth grew long and sharp, capable of tearing through the finest armor as easily as parchment. Most alarming of all was the intelligence that gleamed in his yellow eyes, an awareness that seemed to grow more profound and calculating with each day. The gods began to whisper among themselves in the shadowed corners of Valhalla. They spoke of the prophecies in hushed tones, reminding one another of the seer's warnings about Loki's children. Some argued that they should act immediately, before Fenrir grew too powerful to contain. Others insisted that as long as the wolf remained loyal to Tyr, he posed no immediate threat. But all agreed that something would need to be done eventually, for no prophecy spoken by the Norns had ever failed to come to pass. Odin found himself caught between his desire to prevent the prophesied destruction and his understanding that rash action might actually precipitate the very events he sought to avoid. The All-Father had sacrificed his eye for wisdom, had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge of the runes. Yet all his accumulated understanding seemed inadequate to resolve this particular dilemma. He could see the threads of fate weaving themselves into ever more complex patterns, but he could not discern how to untangle them without making the situation worse. The tension in Asgard grew palpable as Fenrir continued to mature. Warriors who had faced frost giants and fire demons without flinching found themselves unconsciously stepping aside when the great wolf padded through the halls. Servants who had cheerfully served mead to the most fearsome gods began to tremble when Fenrir's golden eyes fell upon them. Even the ravens, Hugin and Munin, usually fearless in their duty to observe and report, began to give the wolf a wide berth. Through all of this growing unease, Tyr remained steadfast in his friendship with Fenrir. The god of war continued to feed the wolf by hand, to wrestle playfully with him in the training grounds, to share quiet moments of companionship that spoke to a bond deeper than mere duty or expedience. Yet even Tyr could not ignore the changes that were occurring in his friend. Fenrir's playfulness began to take on a more dangerous edge. His strength became so great that even careful games sometimes resulted in damage to the surroundings, and there were moments when the wolf's gaze seemed to look right through the present moment, into some distant, apocalyptic future. The breaking point came during the celebration of the winter solstice, when all the gods gathered in the great hall to feast and share tales of their adventures. Fenrir, now grown to truly enormous proportions, lay beside Tyr's chair as had become his custom. The atmosphere was festive, filled with laughter and the warm glow of firelight, reflecting off golden goblets and burnished armor. Yet beneath the merriment, an undercurrent of tension flowed like an underground river, fed by the constant awareness of the massive predator in their midst. As the evening progressed and the mead flowed freely, tongues loosened and old fears began to surface. A young god, emboldened by drink and goaded by his companions, has made a jest about Fenrir's size, wondering aloud whether the wolf might soon grow large enough to swallow the moon itself. The comment was meant as harmless banter, but it struck the assembly like a thunderbolt, for it echoed too closely the ancient prophecies that spoke of a great wolf devouring the celestial bodies during the final battle. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the great fires and the soft sound of Fenrir's breathing. Every eye in the hall turned toward the massive wolf, who had raised his great head to regard the speaker with an expression of profound intelligence and what might have been amusement. For a long moment the tableau held gods and wolf studying one another across a gulf that seemed to widen with each heartbeat. Then Fenrir did something that chilled the blood of every divine being present. He smiled, revealing teeth as long as sword blades and twice as sharp, and in that smile was a knowledge that seemed to encompass not only the present moment, but all the dark possibilities that the future might hold. It was in that moment of terrible silence that Odin knew the time for half measures had passed. The All-Father's single eye met Fenrir's golden gaze across the feast hall, and in that exchange passed an understanding that would forever alter the relationship between the gods and Loki's son. The wolf's smile faded as he sensed the shift in the cosmic winds, replaced by an expression of watchful alertness that spoke to an intelligence far beyond that of any mere beast. The next morning brought with it the kind of gray dawn that seems to leach color from the world, where even the golden halls of Asgard appeared muted and somber. Odin convened a secret council consisting of his most trusted advisors. Frigg his wife, whose gift of prophecy rivaled his own, Balder the Beautiful, whose wisdom was matched only by his compassion, and Heimdall the Watchman, whose sight could pierce through time itself. Notably absent from this gathering was Tyr, for the gods knew that the war god's loyalty to Fenrir would make him an unwilling participant in what was to come. The debate that followed would rage for 3 days and 3 nights, conducted in whispered conferences in the deepest chambers of Valhalla, where even the walls themselves seemed to lean in to catch the weight of such momentous decisions. Frigg argued passionately that they should honor their hospitality and continue to treat Fenrir as a guest in their realm, pointing out that the wolf had committed no crime save being born to the wrong parents. Her voice carried the authority of maternal wisdom, yet even she could not deny the growing darkness that seemed to emanate from Fenrir's presence. Balder, ever the voice of mercy and understanding, proposed that they might seek to reason with Fenrir directly, to explain the prophecies and appeal to whatever goodness might exist within his nature. The god of light believed deeply in the possibility of redemption, in the power of compassion to overcome even the darkest of fates. His suggestion was met with thoughtful consideration, for Baldur's judgment was rarely questioned, and his insights often proved prophetic in their own right. But it was Heimdall who spoke the words that would seal Fenrir's fate, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty that came from his ability to see across all the 9 realms and into the threads of time itself. The Watchman had observed the wolf's growth, not just in body but in power, had witnessed moments when Fenrir's eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire that spoke to forces far beyond the natural world. Most disturbing of all, Heimdall had begun to sense a wrongness in the very fabric of reality whenever Fenrir was present, as if the wolf's existence was somehow unraveling the careful balance that held the cosmos together. The decision, when it finally came, was unanimous yet reluctant. The gods would not kill Fenrir, for that would violate every law of hospitality and honor that governed Asgard. Neither could they continue to allow him to grow in power and size, knowing that each day brought them closer to the prophesied destruction. Instead, they would bind him, contain his growing strength with fetters so strong that even his supernatural power could not break them free. Yet this solution presented its own challenges, for Fenrir was no ordinary wolf to be chained with iron links and leather straps. His strength already surpassed that of the mightiest giants, and his intelligence made him suspicious of any obvious attempt at restraint. The gods would need to be clever to present the binding as something other than what it truly was. They would need to appeal to Fenrir's pride to make him a willing participant in his own imprisonment. The plan they devised was both ingenious and cruel, playing upon the wolf's growing vanity about his own strength. They would present the binding as a test, a game to measure his power against the finest chains that the gods could forge. They would make it a challenge, appealing to his competitive nature and his desire to prove himself worthy of respect among the divine assembly. Most importantly, they would ensure that Tyr was present, for they knew that Fenrir's trust in the god of war might overcome any natural suspicion he might harbor. The first chain they brought to Fenrir was called Lighting, forged from the finest iron in all the 9 realms and tempered in the fires of Muspelheim itself. The links were as thick as a man's arm and gleamed with the dark luster of metal that had been worked by master smiths for months on end. When the gods presented it to Fenrir, they spoke with feigned casualness about their desire to test whether any binding could hold one of his obvious strength and prowess. Fenrir examined the chain with the careful attention of a creature who understood that his life might depend upon such details. He walked around it slowly, his massive head lowered to catch any scent that might reveal hidden enchantments or treachery. His golden eyes studied each link with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient runes, searching for any sign that this was more than the simple test it appeared to be. The gods waited with barely concealed tension, their casual demeanor masking the desperate hope that their plan might succeed. When Fenrir finally agreed to be bound with Lighting, the relief in the hall was palpable, though the gods were careful to hide their emotions behind masks of sporting enthusiasm. They wrapped the great chain around the wolf's massive frame, securing it with locks that would have held the strongest giant captive for eternity. For a moment, hope flickered in divine hearts as the binding seemed to hold, the iron links straining but maintaining their integrity against Fenrir's initial struggles. But that hope was short-lived, for Fenrir's power had grown beyond what even the gods had fully comprehended. With a single flex of his mighty muscles, the wolf shattered lading as easily as a mortal might break a spider's web. The links exploded outward with such force that they embedded themselves deep in the stone walls of the hall, their ringing impacts seemed echoing like thunder through the corridors of Asgard. Fenrir stood among the scattered remnants of the chain, his coat unmarked by the ordeal, his expression one of mild satisfaction at having passed what he still believed to be a simple test of strength. The gods praised his power with enthusiasm that was only partially feigned, congratulating him on his impressive display while privately exchanging glances of growing alarm. If lighting, forged with all the skill of Asgard's finest smiths, could not hold the wolf, what hope did they have of containing his ever-growing strength? Yet they could not abandon their plan now, for Fenrir's power would only continue to increase with each passing day, making future attempts at binding even more hopeless. The second chain was called Dromi, and its forging required resources that strained even the considerable wealth of Asgard. The gods commissioned the dwarves of Nidavellir to create links of unprecedented strength, each one individually blessed by the most powerful runes of binding and containment. The metal itself was gathered from the deepest mines of the mountain realm, where ores touched by primordial magic lay hidden since the world's creation. The chain that emerged from this effort was a masterwork of supernatural craftsmanship, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the firelight. When Dromi was presented to Fenrir, the wolf's examination was even more thorough than before. He could sense the magic woven into every link, could feel the power that radiated from the dwarven runes, like heat from a forge. His nostrils flared as he caught scents that spoke of deep magic and ancient enchantments, warnings that set his instincts ablaze with caution. Yet pride and curiosity warred with suspicion in his mind, for the gods had presented this as an even greater test of his abilities, a chance to prove that his strength had grown beyond all previous bounds. The binding of Dromi required the combined efforts of a dozen gods, for the chain was so heavy that even divine strength struggled to maneuver its massive bulk. As they wrapped it around Fenrir's frame, the wolf felt the weight of more than mere metal settling upon his shoulders. The runes carved into each link seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, tightening around him like living serpents that sought to drain away his strength. For the first time since arriving in Asgard, Fenrir felt a flicker of genuine concern about his situation. Yet when he tested his strength against Dromi, the result was the same as before, though the effort required was considerably greater. The wolf's muscles bulged beneath his thick coat as he strained against the enchanted bonds, his breathing growing labored as he fought against magic that sought to sap his very life force. The hall fell silent, save for the groaning of stressed metal and the sound of Fenrir's increasingly desperate struggles. For long moments, it seemed as though Dromi might actually succeed in its purpose, that the dwarven magic might prove stronger than the wolf's supernatural strength. Then, with a roar that shook the very foundations of Asgard, Fenrir summoned reserves of power that he had not known he possessed. The sound that emerged from his throat was unlike anything heard before in the 9 realms, a vocalization that seemed to contain within it the fury of winter storms and the inevitability of death itself. As his voice echoed through the halls, Dromi began to fracture its carefully crafted links, developing hairline cracks that spread like wildfire through the enchanted metal. The explosion, when Dromi finally shattered, was even more spectacular than Lading's destruction had been. Fragments of the chain flew in every direction with the force of catapult stones, embedding themselves so deeply in the walls that they would never be fully extracted. The magical energies contained within the dwarven runes discharged in brilliant flashes of light that temporarily blinded even divine eyes, while the thunder of the chain's destruction rolled across Asgard like the sound of mountains collapsing. When the chaos finally subsided and the gods could see clearly once more, they found Fenrir standing exactly where he had been before, completely unharmed by the ordeal. If anything, the wolf seemed to have grown larger during the struggle, as if the act of breaking the enchanted chain had somehow fed his own supernatural power. His golden eyes surveyed the assembled gods with an expression that had shifted subtly from mere satisfaction to something approaching contempt, as though he was beginning to understand that these tests were not the innocent games they pretended to be. It was at this moment that the full weight of their situation became clear to the gods of Asgard. They had exhausted their conventional options for containing Fenrir, had called upon the finest craftsmanship and most powerful magic at their disposal, yet the wolf's strength continued to grow beyond all prediction or calculation. The prophecies that had once seemed like distant possibilities now loomed as immediate threats, for how could they hope to maintain any semblance of control over a creature whose power appeared to be unlimited? Odin's response to this crisis would define not only his own legacy, but the ultimate fate of all the 9 realms. The All-Father withdrew to his private chambers, high in the towers of Valhalla, where he surrounded himself with the tools of divination and wisdom that had served him throughout his long reign. He cast the runes repeatedly, seeking some path forward that might yet save his people from the destruction that seemed to grow more inevitable with each passing hour. He consulted the memories stored in his ravens, drawing upon their accumulated observations of Fenrir's behavior and development. Most importantly, he sent his thoughts racing along the branches of Yggdrasil itself, seeking counsel from the wisest beings in all of existence. The solution, when it finally came to him, was as brilliant as it was desperate. If conventional chains could not hold Fenrir, then perhaps unconventional ones might succeed. The gods would need to commission a binding unlike any ever created, one that drew its power not from mere physical strength or magical enchantment, but from the very fabric of reality itself. They would need to call upon the dwarves once more, but this time with a request so unusual and challenging that even those master craftsmen might struggle to fulfill it. The message that Odin sent to Nidavellir was carried by Loki himself, for the trickster god's silver tongue would be needed to convince the dwarves to undertake such an unprecedented task. The irony of using Fenrir's own father as messenger was not lost on the All-Father, but necessity had long since overcome such considerations. Loki's journey to the realm of the dwarves would mark the beginning of the final phase in the god's attempt to contain his son, setting in motion events that would ultimately fulfill the very prophecies they sought to prevent. The realm of Nidavellir lay deep beneath the mountains, where the sound of hammers on anvils had echoed for countless ages. Here, in caverns lit by the eternal glow of forge fires, dwelt the dwarves, whose skill in craftsmanship was renowned throughout all the 9 realms. Their hands could shape metal into forms so perfect they seemed to possess life of their own, could weave magic into mundane materials until they transcended their earthly limitations. Yet even these master artisans had never been asked to create something like what Odin now requested through his messenger. Loki descended through winding passages carved from living rock, his footsteps echoing in the vast underground spaces where the dwarves pursued their craft. The air was thick with the smell of molten metal and the acrid smoke of quenching oils, while the constant rhythm of hammers created a percussion that seemed to match the very heartbeat of the mountain itself. As he approached the great workshop where the dwarf king Eitri held court, Loki could feel the weight of his mission pressing down upon him like the stone ceiling above the request he carried was both simple and impossible. The gods needed a fetter that could hold Fenrir, but this binding could not appear threatening or obviously magical. It must seem like little more than a silken ribbon, something so delicate that the wolf would agree to be bound with it out of curiosity rather than any desire to test his strength. Yet this seemingly fragile cord must possess the power to contain a creature whose might had already shattered the strongest chains ever forged. When Loki finally stood before Eitri in the great hall of the Dwarf King, surrounded by the finest craftsmen of Nidavellir, his silver tongue wove a tale of divine desperation disguised as casual interest. He spoke of the god's desire to create something unprecedented, a binding that would be remembered throughout all the ages as the pinnacle of dwarven achievement. He painted pictures of eternal fame and glory, of a creation so remarkable that it would become legend among all the peoples of the 9 realms. Yet the dwarves were not easily deceived, and they recognized the true nature of what was being asked of them. They understood that this was no mere exercise in craftsmanship, but a desperate attempt to contain something that threatened the very order of existence. The price they named for such work was correspondingly high, requiring payment not in gold or silver, but in secrets and knowledge that even the gods held precious. The negotiations that followed stretched across many days, conducted in the depths of the mountain where time seemed to flow differently than in the upper realms. Loki found himself bargaining not only with his words, but with promises of future favors, with ancient secrets of transformation and illusion, with knowledge that he had gathered during his countless wanderings between worlds. The dwarves listened with the patience of stone, evaluating each offer with the careful precision that marked all their endeavors. Finally, when the terms were agreed upon and the bargains struck, the master craftsmen of Nidavellir began their most ambitious project. They gathered materials that existed nowhere else in the cosmos, elements so rare and precious that their very names were whispered only in the deepest vaults of dwarf lore. The sound of a cat's footstep captured and crystallized into solid form, the breath of a fish woven into threads finer than spider silk, the beard of a woman whose existence challenged the very nature of reality itself, The roots of a mountain were harvested from peaks that touched the sky, their essence distilled into fibers that contained the stubbornness of stone and the patience of ages. The sinews of a bear provided strength that went beyond mere physical power, carrying within them the fury of the wilderness and the determination of creatures who knew no surrender. Most mysterious of all was the spittle of a bird, transformed through alchemical processes so complex that only the eldest dwarves remembered their execution. As these impossible materials were gathered and prepared, the very air in Nidavellir seemed to thicken with anticipation. The forge fires burned with colors that had no names, casting shadows that danced to rhythms older than time itself. The hammers of the master smiths rang out with notes that harmonized into melodies of creation, each strike adding another layer of power to the binding that slowly took shape upon their anvils. The process of weaving these ethereal materials into a cohesive whole required techniques that pushed even dwarven skill to its absolute limits. Master craftsmen who had worked for millennia found themselves learning new methods, discovering principles of creation that they had never imagined possible. The binding that emerged from their efforts defied every expectation, appearing as nothing more than a slender silk ribbon, soft to the touch and light as a feather. Yet those who possessed the sight to perceive magical auras could see the tremendous forces contained within this deceptively simple cord. It pulsed with energies drawn from the fundamental forces that held the cosmos together, its threads woven from contradictions and impossibilities that gave it power beyond physical strength or magical enchantment. The dwarves named their creation Gleipnir, meaning open one, for it would open the path to whatever fate awaited both gods and wolf. When Loki returned to Asgard carrying this marvel of craftsmanship, he found the gods gathered in council, their faces etched with the strain of waiting and uncertainty. The tension that had built during his absence was palpable, for every day that Fenrir remained unbound brought them closer to the fulfillment of the dark prophecies. The wolf's size had continued to increase during the messenger's journey, and his presence in the halls of Asgard had become increasingly unsettling to gods and servants alike. The presentation of Gleipnir to the assembled gods produced a mixture of wonder and skepticism. Here was a binding that looked like it could be broken by a child, yet the dwarves swore that it contained power sufficient to hold even Fenrir's supernatural strength. Some of the gods expressed doubt that such a delicate-seeming cord could succeed where mighty chains had failed, while others marveled at the subtle craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Odin examined Gleipnir with the careful attention of one whose life might depend upon its effectiveness. His single eye studied every thread, every knot, every seemingly insignificant detail of its construction. He could feel the power contained within the ribbon, could sense the impossible materials that had been woven into its structure. Most importantly, he could perceive the contradictions that gave Gleipnir its strength, the way it drew power from things that should not exist, yet somehow did. The challenge now was presenting this new binding to Fenrir in a way that would convince him to submit to it willingly. The wolf had grown suspicious after the destruction of 2 previous chains, and his intelligence made deception increasingly difficult. The gods would need to appeal to his pride and curiosity while concealing the true nature of what they were asking him to accept. They would need to make Gleipnir seem like a puzzle rather than a prison, a challenge worthy of his growing power. The location chosen for this final test was the island of Lyngvi, situated in the middle of a lake called Amsvartnir, far from the golden halls of Asgard. This remote setting would provide the isolation necessary for what was to come, while its natural beauty might help mask the sinister purpose that had brought them there. The island was small but perfectly formed, covered with soft grass and wildflowers that swayed in the gentle breeze from the surrounding waters. As the gods made their preparations for the journey to Lyngvi, Fenrir watched their activities with growing wariness. His supernatural senses detected the undercurrents of fear and determination that flowed beneath their casual demeanor, while his keen intelligence recognized that this third test would be different from the previous two. The wolf's golden eyes followed every movement, every whispered conversation, every meaningful glance exchanged between the gods who claimed to be his friends. Yet it was Tyr's presence that ultimately convinced Fenrir to accompany the divine party to the island. The god of war had maintained his friendship with the wolf throughout all the tensions and suspicions of recent months, never wavering in his loyalty or affection. When Tyr personally invited Fenrir to join them for what he described as a final test of strength in beautiful surroundings, the wolf found his suspicions temporarily overridden by his trust in the one god who had never shown him anything but kindness. The journey to Lyngvi was accomplished by boat, with the gods rowing across the dark waters while Fenrir lay in the bow, his massive head raised to catch the scents carried on the wind. The lake was perfectly still, its surface reflecting the sky like polished metal, broken only by the gentle wake of their passage. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries echoing across the water with a mournful quality that seemed to presage the momentous events about to unfold. Upon reaching the island, the gods spread out across its limited expanse, some gathering firewood for a feast, others preparing comfortable seating areas, all maintaining the pretense that this was merely a pleasant excursion combined with an interesting test of strength. Fenrir explored the island with his usual thoroughness, investigating every rock and tree, every hidden corner where potential threats might lurk. Yet he found nothing more dangerous than wildflowers and the small creatures that made their homes in such peaceful places. When the gods finally presented Gleipnir to Fenrir, they did so with an air of casual curiosity that masked their desperate hope for success. They spoke of the ribbon as an amusing curiosity, a creation of the dwarves that claimed to possess remarkable properties despite its delicate appearance. They wondered aloud whether even Fenrir's great strength might be challenged by something so unusual, so different from the conventional chains they had used in previous tests. Fenrir's examination of Gleipnir was the most thorough yet, for every instinct he possessed screamed warnings about this seemingly innocent length of silk. He could smell the impossibilities woven into its structure, could sense the contradictions that gave it power beyond its appearance. His lips pulled back from his great teeth as he caught scents that should not exist, essences of things that defied the natural order of the world. The wolf's intelligence, honed by months of living among beings who feared him, recognized that this was no simple test of strength. The casual manner of the gods, their studied nonchalance, their careful positioning around the island's perimeter, all spoke to preparations for something far more significant than they were willing to admit. Yet Fenrir found himself caught between suspicion and curiosity, between the warnings of his instincts and his desire to prove his power once more. It was then that he made his fateful demand, the condition that would ensure his binding while simultaneously guaranteeing the doom of the gods. If they truly believed that Gleipnir was merely a test, Fenrir declared, then they should have no objection to providing a guarantee of good faith. One of them must place their hand in his mouth while he was bound, as surety that they would release him immediately if he could not break free on his own. The silence that followed this demand was deafening, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the island's shore and the distant cries of seabirds. Every god present understood the implications of what Fenrir had requested, for none among them could claim ignorance of Gleipnir's true purpose. To place a hand in the wolf's mouth while he was bound would be to guarantee its loss when he discovered their deception, yet to refuse would be to admit that this was no innocent test. The gods exchanged glances heavy with meaning, each hoping that another would volunteer for this sacrifice, each understanding that someone must, if their plan was to succeed. The moments stretched into what felt like hours, as they grappled with the implications of their situation, knowing that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not only their immediate fate, but the ultimate destiny of all the 9 realms. Then Tyr stepped forward, his face set with the grim determination that had made him legendary among gods and mortals alike. The god of war understood better than any other the cost of the choice he was making, knew that his hand would be forfeit the moment Fenrir realized the true nature of their betrayal. Yet he also understood that without this sacrifice, the binding would fail, and with it would die their only hope of preventing the prophesied destruction. As Tyr knelt beside the massive wolf and slowly extended his right hand toward those terrible jaws, the weight of destiny seemed to settle over the island like a shroud. Fenrir's golden eyes met those of his oldest friend, searching for any sign of deception or regret, finding only the steady resolve that had always characterized the god of war. With infinite care, Tyr placed his hand between teeth that could crush stone, trusting in the honor of a creature that the other gods had branded as their doom. The binding of Fenrir with Gleipnir proceeded with deceptive ease, the silken cord wrapping around his massive frame like a lover's caress rather than a prisoner's chains. The gods worked with careful precision, securing each loop and knot with the reverence due to a ritual that would echo through eternity. As the final binding was completed, Fenrir tested his strength against the deceptively delicate fetter, expecting it to part like morning mist before his supernatural power. Instead, Gleipnir held firm, its impossible construction drawing strength from the very forces that Fenrir brought to bear against it. The more he struggled, the tighter it became, feeding on his power and using it to reinforce its own binding properties. For the first time in his life, the great wolf found himself truly helpless, held fast by bonds that grew stronger with every attempt to break them. The moment of Fenrir's realization that he had been betrayed was terrible to behold, his howl of rage and anguish echoing across the lake and beyond, carrying with it a promise of vengeance that would shake the very foundations of Asgard. His jaws snapped shut with the force of a mountain avalanche, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist in a spray of divine blood that stained the peaceful grass of Lyngvi crimson. Yet even as the gods achieved their immediate goal of binding Fenrir, they could not escape the knowledge that they had sealed their own fate in the process. The wolf's eyes, blazing with betrayal and fury, held a promise that transcended his physical imprisonment, a vow of vengeance that would outlast ages and await only the proper moment for its fulfillment. In their desperate attempt to prevent Ragnarok, the gods had instead guaranteed its coming, had transformed a potentially loyal ally into their most implacable enemy. The return journey to Asgard was undertaken in silence, the gods rowing across waters that now seemed dark with portent rather than merely peaceful. Behind them, Fenrir's howls continued to echo across the lake, a sound that would haunt their dreams for all the ages to come. They had won a victory that tasted like defeat, had prevented an immediate threat, while ensuring a far greater catastrophe in the future. Tyr bore his wound without complaint, the stump of his severed hand bound in cloth that quickly became soaked with divine blood. The god of war had paid the price for their deception willingly, yet even he could not escape the knowledge that his sacrifice had purchased only a temporary reprieve from destiny. The friendship he had shared with Fenrir was forever destroyed, replaced by enmity that would endure until the end of all things. In the halls of Asgard, the gods attempted to celebrate their success in binding Loki's son, yet their festivities rang hollow in the shadow of what they had done. They had violated the sacred bonds of hospitality, had betrayed trust and friendship in service of their fear. Most troubling of all, they had confirmed every dark prophecy about Fenrir's role in their destruction, had transformed possibility into certainty through their own actions. The bound wolf remained on the island of Lyngvi, alone but not forgotten, his presence a constant reminder of the gods' betrayal and the price of their fear. With each passing day, his rage grew deeper and more focused, his hatred refining itself into something pure and terrible. The gentle island became a place of dread, where no bird would sing and no flower would bloom, poisoned by the fury of the creature trapped at its heart. News of Fenrir's binding spread throughout the 9 realms, carried by winds and whispers, by the flight of ravens and the dreams of seers. In Jotunheim, Angerboda felt her son's anguish as a physical pain, her maternal heart breaking with each echo of his distant howls. Loki, learning of his child's fate, felt something fundamental shift within his nature, the last vestiges of loyalty to Asgard crumbling beneath the weight of this ultimate betrayal. Thus did the gods achieve their victory over Fenrir, binding the wolf with chains forged from impossibilities and sealed with treachery. Yet in their triumph lay the seeds of their destruction, for they had made an enemy whose hatred would burn until the stars themselves grew cold, whose vengeance would remake the very cosmos in fire and blood. The binding of Fenrir marked the beginning of a new age in the 9 realms, one where the delicate balance between order and chaos had been irrevocably altered by the gods' desperate actions. Word of the great wolf's imprisonment spread like wildfire through every corner of existence, carried by the winds that blew across Yggdrasil's mighty branches and whispered in the shadows of every realm. Yet with each telling, the story grew darker, the implications more ominous, until even the most distant corners of creation trembled at what the gods had wrought. In the frozen wastes of Jotunheim, where ancient giants carved their wisdom into glacial walls and storm clouds gathered like vengeful armies, the news struck with the force of an avalanche. Angerboda, the prophetic giantess whose love had created the three children destined to bring about Ragnarok, felt her son's anguish as if it were her own flesh being torn asunder. Her screams of grief echoed through the crystalline caverns of her mountain home, shattering ice formations that had stood for millennia and sending tremors through the very bedrock of the giant realm. The mother's pain transcended mere emotion, becoming a force of nature that manifested in terrible ways throughout Jotunheim. Blizzards raged where none had blown before, their fury matching the storm in Angerboda's heart. Ancient rivers froze solid in their beds, their flow stopped by the chill of maternal despair. The aurora that normally danced across the northern skies turned blood red, painting the landscape in colors that spoke of violence and retribution yet to come. Other giants, those ancient beings who had witnessed the birth of worlds and the death of stars, recognized the cosmic significance of what had occurred. They understood that the binding of Fenrir represented more than mere imprisonment, that it marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between the established order and the forces of change. The old alliances and enmities that had defined the cosmos since its creation were crumbling, replaced by new patterns of conflict that would reshape the very nature of existence. Among the frost giants, whispers began to spread of ancient prophecies and forgotten oaths. Elders who had remained neutral in the endless conflicts between gods and giants found themselves reconsidering their positions, their ancient wisdom telling them that neutrality would no longer be possible in the world that was coming. The binding of Angerboda's son had created ripples that would eventually become tsunamis, washing away the old certainties and leaving only chaos in their wake. Meanwhile, in the dark halls beneath the earth, where hell ruled over the dishonored dead, Fenrir's sister felt her brother's torment as a cold fire burning in her half-living heart. The goddess of death had always possessed an otherworldly beauty that spoke to her dual nature, one half radiant and divine, the other rotting and corpse-like. Yet as news of Fenrir's betrayal reached her realm, the living side of her face grew pale with fury, while the dead side seemed to animate with a terrible purpose. Hell's domain, normally a place of quiet melancholy, where the souls of those who died of sickness and old age found their eternal rest, began to change in response to her emotional upheaval. The neutral gray light that had always illuminated her halls flickered and dimmed, replaced by an ominous red glow that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The rivers that flowed through her realm, normally placid and silent, began to bubble and steam as if heated by underground fires. The dead themselves, those countless souls who had found peace in hell's embrace, stirred uneasily in their eternal rest. They whispered among themselves in languages forgotten by the living, sharing dreams that had turned dark, and prophetic veterans of ancient wars spoke of battles yet to come, while plague victims murmured of diseases that would ravage the 9 realms. All seemed to sense that their peaceful afterlife was about to be shattered by events unfolding in the world above. Hell summoned her most trusted advisors, the ancient spirits who had served her since the beginning of her reign over the dead. These beings, neither fully alive nor completely deceased, possessed wisdom gleaned from countless ages of observing mortal folly and divine hubris. They confirmed what the goddess already knew in her heart. The binding of Fenrir had set in motion forces that would ultimately bring about the destruction of everything the gods held dear. Far beneath the ocean waves that encircled Midgard, in the deepest trenches where sunlight had never penetrated, Jormungandr, the world serpent, felt his brother's anguish through the mystical bonds that connected all of Loki's children. The massive serpent had grown to incredible proportions since his banishment from Asgard, his coils now stretching around the entire world, his tail firmly grasped in his own jaws in the eternal symbol of Ouroboros. Yet even his titanic size could not contain the rage that began to build within him as he sensed Fenrir's betrayal and imprisonment. The world serpent's fury manifested in ways that sent shockwaves throughout the ocean realms. Tidal waves rose without warning, crashing against distant shores with devastating force. Whirlpools opened in the deepest waters, swallowing ships and sea monsters alike into their spiraling maws. The very currents of the ocean began to shift, disrupting patterns of flow that had remained constant since the world's creation. Sailors throughout the 9 realms reported strange phenomena in the months following Fenrir's binding. Ships found themselves becalmed in waters that should have carried steady winds, while others were caught in sudden storms that arose from perfectly clear skies. Sea creatures behaved erratically, with whales beaching themselves on foreign shores and schools of fish swimming in impossible formations that seemed to spell out runes of warning in the ancient tongue. The merfolk and other ocean dwellers, those beings who made their homes in the spaces between the waves, spoke in hushed tones of the great serpent's restlessness. They reported seeing his massive form stirring in the deepest trenches, his movements causing underwater earthquakes that reshaped the ocean floor. Some claimed to have witnessed his eyes opening for the first time in centuries, glowing with an inner fire that turned the surrounding waters to steam. In the mortal realm of Midgard, humans began to experience strange dreams and visions that spoke of coming catastrophe. Seers and wise women found their prophetic abilities heightened to unprecedented levels, their visions filled with images of fire and flood, of wolves devouring the sun and serpents rising from the sea. These prophecies spread from village to village, creating an atmosphere of growing dread that hung over the human world like a funeral shroud. The natural world itself seemed to respond to the cosmic disturbance created by Fenrir's binding. Seasons began to arrive at irregular intervals, with winter lingering far beyond its proper time, and summer arriving with scorching heat that withered crops and dried up rivers. Animals displayed unusual behavior, with predators and prey gathering together in ways that violated every natural law, as if they sensed that the old order was breaking down. Birds, those creatures most sensitive to the subtle currents that flow between the realms, began to migrate in patterns that made no sense to human observers. Flocks that should have been heading south for winter instead flew north toward the frozen wastes, while others circled endlessly in the sky as if unable to find their proper destination. Their cries, normally melodious or purposeful, took on harsh, discordant qualities that seemed to echo the anguish of the bound wolf. The trees themselves, those ancient witnesses to the passage of ages, began to show signs of distress. Leaves yellowed and fell out of season, while bark cracked and wept sap that gleamed like tears in the uncertain light. The great forests that had stood since the world's youth whispered constantly now, their rustling carrying messages of doom from one woodland to another, across vast distances. In Asgard itself, the gods attempted to return to their normal routines, yet the shadow of what they had done hung over every gathering, every feast, every moment of supposed celebration. The golden halls that had once rung with laughter and heroic tales now echoed with forced merriment and conversations that died away into uncomfortable silences. Even the most powerful among them could not escape the knowledge that their actions had fundamentally altered the cosmic balance. Odin found himself increasingly isolated, spending long hours in his high tower study, surrounded by books of prophecy and divination that offered no comfort, only confirmation of the dark future they had set in motion. The All-Father's ravens, Hugin and Munin, returned each day with reports that grew progressively more disturbing. Thought and memory brought word of unrest in every realm, of alliances shifting and ancient enemies reconsidering their positions in light of the gods' betrayal of their guest friend Frigg. The All-Mother, whose gift of prophecy rivaled her husband's wisdom, found herself haunted by visions of fire consuming the golden halls of Asgard. She saw in her dreams the great ash tree Yggdrasil trembling as its roots were gnawed by serpents and its branches battered by winds that carried the scent of ending. Her maternal instincts, honed by eons of caring for the divine family, told her that their actions had wounded something fundamental in the structure of reality itself. Thor, the thunder god whose mighty hammer had never failed to protect Asgard from its enemies, discovered that his legendary strength felt somehow diminished in the wake of Fenrir's binding, not physically, for his muscles remained as powerful as ever, and his hammer still crackled with divine lightning. Rather, it was his confidence that had been shaken, his certainty that right would always triumph over wrong, that the gods were the guardians of cosmic justice rather than its violators. The god of thunder found himself spending more time alone, walking the boundaries of Asgard and gazing out toward the distant realms with troubled eyes. He could feel the weight of countless watching presences, enemies both old and new, who sensed that the gods' moral authority had been compromised by their treatment of Fenrir. The challenges that lay ahead would require more than strength of arm to overcome, and Thor was beginning to understand that his hammer might not be enough to protect everything he held dear. Balder the Beautiful, whose radiance had always served as a beacon of hope and renewal within the divine realm, found his inner light dimming as he contemplated the implications of their collective action. The god of light and purity had argued for mercy and understanding, had believed that compassion could overcome even the darkest prophecies. The failure of his philosophy, the triumph of fear over love, left him struggling with doubts that had never troubled his perfect nature before. The other gods, seeing their most beloved members suffering from spiritual anguish, began to understand the true cost of their victory over Fenrir. They had not merely bound a dangerous creature, they had compromised their own divine nature, had chosen expedience over honor, fear over faith. The binding of the wolf had revealed something ugly within themselves, something that cast shadows over their claims to moral superiority over giants and mortals alike. Tyr bore his physical wound with the stoic endurance that had always characterized the god of war, yet the loss of his sword hand was the least of his injuries. The betrayal of his friendship with Fenrir had wounded something deeper than flesh, had violated the code of honor that formed the very core of his divine identity. The god who had always stood for justice and fair dealing found himself questioning whether their actions could ever be justified, regardless of their necessity. The severed hand had been carefully preserved and honored, placed in a shrine where it served as a constant reminder of the price of their deception. Yet Tyr found no comfort in the reverence shown to his sacrifice, for he knew that it had been purchased with treachery. The friendship he had shared with Fenrir, genuine despite its tragic end, had been the most meaningful relationship of his divine existence, and its destruction left him feeling hollow and diminished. Training with his remaining hand, Tyr discovered that his legendary skill in combat had been fundamentally altered by his loss. Not merely because he lacked his dominant hand, though that certainly presented challenges, but because the act of betraying Fenrir had introduced uncertainty into his warrior's heart. The absolute confidence that had always guided his sword arm was gone, replaced by a nagging doubt about the righteousness of his cause and the justice of his actions. As word of Tyr's sacrifice spread throughout the 9 realms, the god found himself hailed as a hero by some and condemned as a villain by others. Those who supported the god's actions praised his willingness to pay the ultimate price for the safety of Asgard, while those who sympathized with Fenrir branded him as a betrayer who had violated the most sacred bonds of friendship and honor. The division of opinion reflected the broader moral ambiguity that now surrounded the entire affair. Loki's reaction to his son's binding was perhaps the most complex and ultimately the most dangerous of all. The trickster god had served as messenger in the commissions of Gleipnir, had participated in his own child's betrayal through his silver tongue and persuasive arguments with the dwarves. Yet he had done so believing, or perhaps hoping, that some alternative solution might yet be found, that his cleverness might somehow save both his son and the gods he had served for so long. When the full reality of Fenrir's binding became clear, when Loki understood that his beloved child would remain imprisoned on that desolate island for all eternity, something fundamental broke within the trickster's complex nature. The god, who had always walked the line between order and chaos, who had served Asgard faithfully despite his giant blood and mercurial temperament, found that line finally crossed beyond any possibility of return. Loki's transformation in the wake of his son's binding was subtle at first, manifesting in small acts of sabotage and mischief that seemed merely typical of his chaotic nature. Yet those who knew him well began to notice a new edge to his tricks, a cruelty that had not been present before. His pranks, once harmless if annoying, began to carry genuine malice. His words, always sharp, now seemed designed to wound rather than merely irritate. The shapeshifter's legendary ability to see all sides of any situation, to find creative solutions to impossible problems, began to focus increasingly on ways to undermine the stability of Asgard. He who had once been the god's greatest problem solver became their most insidious threat, using his intimate knowledge of their weaknesses and fears to sow discord and doubt throughout the divine realm. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all was the way Loki's love for his children began to transform from protective affection into something darker and more destructive. His grief over Fenrir's fate merged with his anger at the god's betrayal, creating a toxic combination that would ultimately poison every relationship he had built over the centuries of his service to Asgard. The trickster god began to visit his bound son on the island of Lyngvi, appearing in forms that could slip past whatever wards the gods had placed around that desolate place. Sometimes he came as a raven, perching near Fenrir's massive form and croaking words of comfort and vengeance in the ancient tongue. Other times, he appeared as a wolf himself, smaller than his son, but sharing the same gray coat and golden eyes, lying beside the bound giant in silent communion of grief and rage. During these visits, Loki whispered to Fenrir of the future, of the prophecies that spoke of the wolf's ultimate liberation and the role he would play in the destruction of those who had betrayed him. He spoke of Ragnarok not as a distant possibility, but as an inevitable certainty, a cosmic correction that would restore the balance the gods had upset through their actions. These conversations, part comfort and part conspiracy, served to focus Fenrir's rage while deepening Loki's own commitment to revenge. The bound wolf listened to his father's words with an intelligence that had only grown sharper during his imprisonment. Fenrir's understanding of the cosmic forces at play, of the intricate web of cause and effect that governed the fate of the 9 realms, expanded as he had time to contemplate his situation and its implications. The simple wolf who had once played in the halls of Asgard was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a creature whose intelligence matched his physical power, whose hatred was tempered by strategic thinking. Through their secret communications, father and son began to plan for a future that would see their enemies brought low and the old order swept away in fire and blood. They spoke of allies who might be turned, of weaknesses that could be exploited, of the precise moment when the cosmic balance would shift enough to allow Fenrir's liberation. These conversations, conducted in whispers and glances, in the subtle language of gesture and expression, laid the groundwork for the final battle that would consume everything. The island of Lyngvi itself began to change under the influence of its supernatural prisoner. The flowers that had once bloomed in its meadows withered and died, replaced by thorny weeds that seemed to feed on the wolf's anguish. The grass turned brown and brittle, crackling underfoot like old bones. The very air grew thick and oppressive, carrying scents of decay and violence that made even the bravest gods reluctant to visit their captive. Yet it was not merely the physical environment that was transformed by Fenrir's presence. The island became a focal point for darker forces, a gathering place for creatures and spirits that thrived on conflict and destruction. Ravens and crows arrived in ever-increasing numbers, their harsh cries adding to the cacophony of despair that surrounded the bound wolf. Serpents slithered from the lake's depths to sun themselves on the rocky shores, their cold eyes reflecting the same hatred that burned in Fenrir's gaze. The lake Amsvarnir, once clear and peaceful, began to darken with each passing season, its waters taking on the color of old blood. Fish died in massive numbers, their corpses floating to the surface in patterns that seemed almost runic in their arrangement. The very currents of the lake shifted, creating whirlpools and eddies that drew unwary travelers to their doom while somehow never affecting the island at its center. Local populations of mortals, those hardy souls who made their living from the lake's resources, began to report strange phenomena that grew more disturbing with each telling. Fishermen spoke of seeing a massive wolf-shaped shadow moving beneath the waters, while farmers claimed that their livestock would refuse to drink from streams that fed into Amsvartnir. Children began to suffer from nightmares filled with images of golden eyes and terrible teeth, waking screams that spoke of visions too adult and too terrifying for their young minds to process. The transformation of Fenrir's prison into a nexus of dark power was not lost on the seers and wise women who served the various peoples of the 9 realms. Their divinations, once focused on seasonal changes and local conflicts, began to center increasingly on the bound wolf and the growing darkness that surrounded him. Prophecies spoke of a time when the bonds would break, when the wolf would rise from his island prison to devour not merely his enemies, but the very foundations of reality itself. These visions, shared through the networks of mystical communication that connected seers across vast distances, began to create a sense of inevitable doom that permeated all levels of society throughout the 9 realms. Kings and thralls alike found themselves haunted by dreams of ending, while even the gods themselves began to experience premonitions that spoke of their own mortality in ways they had never contemplated before. The binding of Fenrir had accomplished its immediate goal of removing a potential threat from the halls of Asgard, yet it had also created something far more dangerous, a symbol of divine injustice that would serve as a rallying point for every enemy the gods had ever made. The wolf's imprisonment had revealed the fundamental hypocrisy that lay beneath their claims to moral authority, had shown that fear could drive even the wisest beings to acts of treachery and betrayal. As the seasons turned and years passed in the wake of Fenrir's binding, the cosmic balance that had maintained stability throughout the 9 realms began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The very forces that held reality together seemed to weaken in response to the violation of cosmic law that the gods' actions represented. Magic itself became more unpredictable, with spells failing at crucial moments and enchantments producing unexpected results. The great ash tree Yggdrasil, that cosmic pillar whose roots and branches connected all the realms of existence, began to show signs of distress that alarmed even the most powerful beings in creation. Its leaves, normally a vibrant green that spoke of eternal life and renewal, began to yellow and fall out of season. The well of Urd, where the Norns wove the fates of gods and mortals alike, became clouded and difficult to read, as if the future itself had become uncertain in ways it had never been before. The 3 sisters who controlled destiny, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, representing past, present, and future, found their work increasingly complicated by the paradoxes and contradictions that Fenrir's binding had introduced into the cosmic order. The threads of fate that they wove began to tangle in unexpected ways, creating knots and snarls that defied their attempts at resolution. The neat patterns that had once governed the flow of events became chaotic and unpredictable, reflecting the fundamental disruption that the gods' actions had caused. Thus did the binding of Fenrir mark the beginning of the end times, the first act in the cosmic drama that would ultimately consume everything the gods had built and cherished. The wolf's imprisonment had been achieved through treachery and maintained through force, yet it had also unleashed forces that would prove far more destructive than anything the bound creature could have accomplished while free. In their desperate attempt to prevent their own destruction, the gods had instead guaranteed it, had set in motion the very events that would bring about the twilight of their golden age and the dawn of a new and terrible era. The knowledge of what they had wrought spread through the divine realm like poison seeping through golden veins, corrupting the very essence of what Asgard had once represented. In the great hall, where feasts had once celebrated victories over giants and demons, the gods now gathered in hushed councils, their voices barely rising above whispers, as they discussed the growing signs of cosmic disturbance that followed in the wake of their collective betrayal. Heimdall, whose sight could pierce through all the 9 realms, and whose hearing could detect the growth of wool on a sheep's back, brought increasingly disturbing reports from his post at the Rainbow Bridge. The watchman spoke of strange lights flickering at the edges of reality, of sounds that carried no meaning, yet seemed pregnant with terrible purpose. His perfect vision, which had never failed him throughout the long ages of his service, now showed him glimpses of possible futures that made even his immortal courage falter. The Guardian of Bifrost described how the Rainbow Bridge itself had begun to exhibit subtle changes in its prismatic beauty, with new colors appearing that had no names in any language spoken by gods or mortals. These alien hues seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, creating patterns that hurt to observe directly, yet drew the eye with hypnotic fascination. Even more troubling were the moments when the bridge would flicker and fade, as if the connections between the realms were becoming unstable in ways that threatened the very structure of existence. Warriors who had crossed Bifrost for countless millennia found themselves disoriented during their journeys, arriving at their destinations with memories of paths they had never walked and conversations they had never held. Some reported brief glimpses of other versions of themselves, darker reflections that seemed to mock their heroic deeds and noble intentions. These phantom encounters left even the bravest champions shaken, their confidence in the absolute nature of reality fundamentally undermined. In the vast libraries of Asgard, where the accumulated wisdom of ages was stored in books bound with dragon leather and inscribed with inks made from the blood of vanquished enemies, scholars made discoveries that filled them with dread. Ancient texts that had remained unchanged for millennia suddenly contained new passages, prophetic verses that spoke of the bound wolf's eventual liberation and the terrible vengeance that would follow. The words appeared to write themselves, flowing across parchment in scripts that shifted and changed even as they were being read. The most learned among the divine scribes recognized these additions as genuine prophecy, bearing the unmistakable marks of oracular truth that could not be forged or fabricated. Yet the knowledge contained within these spontaneous revelations was so dark, so absolute in its promise of destruction, that many who read them found themselves unable to sleep for weeks afterward. The texts spoke of fire consuming the golden halls, of the great tree Yggdrasil withering and dying, of gods falling beneath the fangs of creatures they had themselves created through their fear and hatred. Particularly disturbing were the passages that described the moment of Fenrir's liberation in precise detail, complete with astronomical alignments and cosmic signs that would herald the beginning of the final battle. These prophecies painted a picture of inevitability that seemed to mock any attempt at prevention or mitigation, suggesting that the very act of binding the wolf had locked the gods into a course of action that could only end in their complete destruction. The divine artisans and craftsmen of Asgard found their work increasingly affected by the cosmic disturbance that surrounded Fenrir's imprisonment. Weapons forged in the great smithies would crack without warning, their metal developing flaws that seemed to emerge from within the very atoms of their structure. Armor crafted by master metalworkers would tarnish and corrode overnight, as if exposed to acids that existed only in nightmares. Even the simplest tools would break in the hands of gods who had wielded similar implements for thousands of years without incident. The golden halls themselves began to show signs of decay that should have been impossible given their divine construction. Stones that had been set in place at the world's foundation developed hairline cracks that spread like spider webs across entire walls. Tapestries woven from the hair of Valkyries and dyed with pigments extracted from rainbow light began to fade and fray, their brilliant colors leaching away to leave behind gray shadows of their former beauty. The very air within the halls grew heavy and oppressive, carrying scents of decay and abandonment that spoke of endings rather than eternal glory. Musicians who had entertained the gods for countless ages found their instruments producing discordant notes that seemed to emerge from sources beyond their control. Harps would play melodies of mourning without being touched, while drums would beat rhythms that matched the labored breathing of dying creatures. The songs that had once celebrated heroic deeds and divine triumphs transformed into laments for what was lost and elegies for what would never return. The great feasting tables, where gods had gathered to share the meat of the cosmic boar Saehrimnir and drink mead from the goat Hadron's endless supply, became scenes of forced merriment that fooled no one. Conversations that had once flowed as freely as wine now stuttered and died, killed by the weight of unspoken guilt and growing dread. The food itself seemed to lose its divine properties, no longer providing the perfect sustenance that had sustained the gods throughout their immortal existence. Even sleep, that refuge available to all conscious beings, became a torment for the gods of Asgard. Their dreams, once filled with visions of past victories and future glories, transformed into landscapes of ash and bone where familiar faces wore expressions of accusation and betrayal. Many reported recurring nightmares in which they found themselves on the island of Lyngvi, standing before the bound wolf whose golden eyes held all the accumulated hatred of eternity. In these dream encounters, Fenrir would speak to them in voices that carried the authority of prophecy, describing in intimate detail the role each god would play in the coming destruction. The wolf's words carried such conviction, such absolute certainty, that even the bravest among the divine assembly would wake screaming, their immortal minds struggling to process the horror of their own foretold deaths. Frigg, whose mother's heart had always been the emotional center of the divine family, found herself particularly tormented by visions that showed her beloved son Balder falling victim to schemes set in motion by their treatment of Fenrir the All-Mother's prophetic gifts, usually a source of wisdom and guidance, became a curse that forced her to witness countless variations of the same tragic theme, the destruction of everything she held dear. As direct consequence of their collective betrayal, the goddess began to withdraw from the social life of Asgard, spending long hours alone in her private chambers where she attempted to weave protective spells around her family members. Yet every thread she spun seemed to tangle with the darker patterns that surrounded Fenrir's binding, creating knots that could not be untied and weaving designs that spoke of inevitability rather than protection. Her desperate attempts to alter fate through magic and prophecy only served to reinforce the growing understanding that their actions had set events in motion that could not be stopped or redirected. The cosmic forces they had disturbed by binding Fenrir were too fundamental, too deeply rooted in the structure of reality itself, to be countered by even the most powerful divine intervention. Meanwhile, in the mortal realm of Midgard, the effects of the cosmic disturbance began to manifest in ways that terrified and confused the human populations. Seasons arrived out of order, with winter storms striking during what should have been the height of summer, while scorching heat waves baked the earth during months when snow should have covered the ground. Rivers changed their courses overnight, flowing uphill or disappearing entirely into sinkholes that opened without warning. The sun itself seemed affected by the cosmic imbalance, occasionally flickering like a candle flame caught in an unexpected breeze. During these moments of solar uncertainty, shadows would behave strangely, sometimes moving independently of the objects that cast them or disappearing entirely even in bright daylight. The moon showed similar irregularities, sometimes appearing during daylight hours or failing to rise when expected, leaving nights so dark that even torches seemed to provide no illumination. Animals throughout Midgard began exhibiting behaviors that defied every natural law and instinct that had governed their species since creation. Wolves howled constantly, their voices taking on harmonics that seemed to echo from impossible distances. Their songs carried themes of longing and vengeance that even humans could understand, creating an atmosphere of dread that settled over entire regions. Like a plague's domestic dogs would refuse to enter certain areas, whimpering and cowering as if they sensed the presence of their wild cousin's supernatural patron. Birds migrated in patterns that formed runic symbols across the sky, their formations spelling out words in the ancient tongue that spoke of endings and transformations. Flocks that should have been heading toward their traditional nesting grounds instead circled endlessly above lakes and rivers, their cries creating cacophonies that sounded almost like voices raised in lamentation or protest. The very fabric of magic itself became unpredictable throughout all the realms, with spells that had worked reliably for centuries suddenly producing unexpected or dangerous results. Healers found their arts turned to harm, with potions meant to cure sickness instead causing new and exotic diseases. Seers discovered that their visions showed only darkness and confusion, as if the future itself had become too unstable to predict with any accuracy. Runes carved into stone would change their meanings overnight, transforming blessings into curses and protective wards into invitations for malevolent spirits. The ancient scripts that recorded the wisdom of ages began to shift and flow like living things, rearranging themselves into new configurations that spoke of catastrophe and transformation. Even the most experienced practitioners of the mystical arts found themselves unable to trust the tools and techniques that had served them faithfully throughout their careers. The dwarves of Nidavellir, whose craftsmanship had created Gleipnir and countless other wonders, discovered that their legendary skill was being corrupted by the cosmic disturbance their creation had helped to cause. Metals would not hold their shapes, flowing like water, even when cool, while gems cracked and shattered for no apparent reason. The great forges that had burned since the world's youth began to gutter and dim, their fires lacking the intensity needed for the finest work. Master smiths who had created artifacts of legend found themselves unable to complete even the simplest projects, their hammers striking false notes on anvils that had once rung with perfect pitch. The very ore they mined from the deepest shafts seemed tainted, containing impurities that could not be removed through any known process of refinement. Some dwarves reported that their tools would rebel against them, refusing to perform their intended functions or even turning against their wielders with apparent malice. The mountain halls that had echoed with the sounds of productive industry for millennia grew increasingly quiet as the dwarves struggled to understand and adapt to the changes affecting their realm. Ancient machines that had operated flawlessly for thousands of years began to break down in cascading failures that defied all attempts at repair. The great water wheel that powered their largest workshops slowed and stopped, its mechanisms inexplicably seizing despite perfect maintenance. In the light elf realm of Alfheim, where beauty and harmony had reigned supreme since the dawn of creation, similar disruptions began to manifest in ways that struck at the very core of elven nature. The eternal twilight that bathed their realm in perfect golden light began to flicker and fade, replaced by harsh shadows that seemed to carry whispers of malevolent intent. Gardens that had bloomed in perpetual springtime withered and died, their flowers turning black and crumbling to ash at the slightest touch. The light elves themselves, beings of such ethereal beauty that mortal eyes could barely comprehend their forms, began to show signs of corruption that horrified even their immortal consciousness. Their radiant skin developed dark patches that spread like infections, while their voices, once capable of melodies that could heal wounded hearts, began to produce discordant sounds that caused pain rather than pleasure. Music, which had always been the foundation of elven civilization and the source of their greatest magical power, became a torture rather than a joy. Instruments that had created heavenly harmonies for eons suddenly produced only cacophony, their strings snapping without provocation and their resonating chambers cracking despite being crafted from materials that should have lasted until the end of time. The great libraries of Alfheim, where the light elves had collected the most beautiful poetry and song from across all the realms, found their collections spontaneously combusting without flame or heat. Scrolls containing verses of such beauty that they could move mountains to tears turned to dust, while books bound in starlight and moonbeams simply faded from existence as if they had never been written. Even in Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods who had once waged war against the Aesir before joining them in alliance, the effects of Fenrir's binding created disruptions that threatened the delicate balance of power that had maintained peace between the two divine factions. The fertility magic that was the Vanir's greatest strength began to produce twisted and unnatural growths, with crops that should have fed multitudes, instead yielding poisonous fruits that brought madness to those who consumed them. The seas and winds that had once carried the blessings of Njord and his children throughout the realms became unpredictable and dangerous, with storms arising from clear skies and calms falling over areas that should have been swept by favorable breezes. Ships blessed by Vanir priests found themselves becalmed in the middle of vital journeys, while others were driven onto rocks by winds that seemed to blow from all directions simultaneously. Freyr, the Vanir lord of fertility and kingship, discovered that his legendary sword, given away in exchange for love, was needed now more than ever as the natural order he protected began to collapse around him. Without his blade, the god found himself increasingly powerless to maintain the agricultural cycles that sustained life throughout the realms, watching helplessly as fields that had been green and productive for millennia turned to barren wasteland overnight. His sister Freya, goddess of love and cider magic, found her own powers twisted by the cosmic disturbance surrounding Fenrir's binding. The love magic that had once brought joy and harmony to countless couples began to produce obsession and hatred instead, while her prophetic abilities showed her only visions of destruction and despair. The beautiful goddess wept tears of gold that turned to lead before they could fall, her immortal beauty dimming as the darkness spread throughout all the realms. The great boar Gullinbursti, whose golden bristles had once illuminated the darkest corners of creation, began to lose its radiance, its light flickering like a dying ember. The magnificent creature that had been a symbol of the Vanir's power over fertility and growth now wandered aimlessly through empty fields, its presence no longer able to encourage the growth of even the hardiest weeds. Throughout all these realms, the message was the same. The binding of Fenrir had disrupted something fundamental in the cosmic order, something that connected all things in a web of cause and effect that the gods had never fully understood until they had torn it asunder. Their act of self-preservation had become an act of universal destruction, setting in motion forces that would consume not only their enemies, but everything they had sworn to protect. The realization of what they had done began to settle over the gods like a shroud, heavy with the weight of inevitable consequence. They had sought to prevent their own destruction by destroying the innocent trust of a creature who had done them no harm, and in doing so had guaranteed that their fears would become reality. The prophecy they had sought to prevent had become self-fulfilling, transformed from possibility into certainty by their own desperate actions. Yet perhaps most terrifying of all was the growing understanding that this was only the beginning, that the binding of Fenrir had merely set the stage for greater catastrophes to come. The cosmic balance had been upset in ways that would require increasingly dramatic corrections, each more destructive than the last, until the very foundations of reality would crumble beneath the weight of accumulated injustice and betrayal. In the silence that followed each new revelation of the spreading chaos, the gods could almost hear the distant sound of chains beginning to weaken, of impossible bindings slowly losing their power as the cosmic forces they had violated sought to restore the natural order through whatever means necessary. The wolf remained bound, but his prison was becoming a focal point for energies that would eventually shatter not only his chains, but the entire world that had forged them. The cosmic disturbance that radiated outward from Fenrir's binding created ripples that touched every corner of existence. Yet nowhere were these effects more profound than in the realm where time itself was woven into the fabric of reality. The Well of Urd, that sacred spring beneath Yggdrasil's roots, where the three Norns shaped destiny with threads of pure possibility, began to exhibit changes that alarmed even these ancient architects of fate. Urd, the eldest sister who governed the past, found her normally crystal clear memories becoming clouded with alternative histories that had never occurred yet, somehow felt equally real. Events she had witnessed and recorded for countless millennia began to shift and change in her recollection, as if the very foundation of what had been was becoming unstable. Battles won became battles lost. Heroes who had died in glory now seemed to have lived in obscurity, and the careful chronicles of divine achievement began to blur and merge with darker possibilities. Verdandi, who ruled the present moment with absolute authority, discovered that her perception of current events was becoming fragmented and contradictory. She would observe Fenrir bound upon his island prison, yet simultaneously see him free and ranging through forests that existed in no known realm. The normally precise goddess found herself witnessing multiple versions of the same moment, each equally valid yet mutually exclusive, creating a paradox that threatened to tear apart her fundamental understanding of temporal reality. Most disturbing of all was the transformations occurring within Skuld, the youngest Norn whose domain encompassed all possible futures. Where once she had seen countless branching paths spreading out from each moment like the limbs of an infinite tree, now she perceived only a single thread of destiny, dark and inexorable, leading toward a conclusion so absolute that no amount of divine intervention could alter its course. The future, which had always been fluid and malleable to those with sufficient power and wisdom, had crystallized into something as fixed and immutable as the past. The three sisters gathered around their well with increasing frequency, their ancient voices raised in discussions that grew more heated with each passing season. They spoke in the old tongue, using words that predated the existence of gods and giants, attempting to understand how their careful work had become so fundamentally disrupted. Their looms, which had woven the threads of fate since time began, now produced tapestries that showed only scenes of destruction and ending, no matter how they attempted to guide the patterns. The water of Urd's well itself began to change, its surface taking on a dark reflection that showed not the faces of those who gazed into it, but glimpses of what they would become in the final days. Gods who looked upon their reflections saw themselves fallen and broken, their divine radiance extinguished forever. Even the Norns themselves appeared in these visions as withered shadows of their former power, their ability to shape destiny rendered meaningless by forces they could no longer comprehend or control. The great ash tree that sheltered the well began to show signs of distress that sent tremors of fear throughout all the realms. Yggdrasil's mighty trunk, which had stood unchanged since the world's creation, developed deep cracks that wept a sap the color of old blood. Its roots, which extended into every realm and connected all things in an intricate network of life and power, began to wither and blacken as if poisoned by some cosmic toxin that spread through the very essence of existence. The leaves of the world tree, each one representing a life in one of the 9 realms, began to fall in unprecedented numbers. Where once only the natural deaths of mortals would cause the occasional leaf to drift down to the well's surface, now entire branches shed their foliage in cascades that darkened the sacred waters. The sound of falling leaves became a constant whisper, like voices mourning for losses not yet fully realized. Ratatoskr, the squirrel who had carried messages up and down Yggdrasil's trunk for eons, brought increasingly disturbing reports from the tree's various levels. The great serpent Nidhogg, who gnawed constantly at the world tree's roots in the deepest reaches of the underworld, had intensified his efforts, as if driven by the same cosmic disturbance that affected all other aspects of reality. His teeth, already capable of penetrating the most divine wood, seemed to have gained new sharpness and veracity. The eagle that perched in Yggdrasil's highest branches, whose keen eyes could observe all that transpired throughout the 9 realms, reported seeing things that defied explanation or description. Strange lights flickered at the edges of reality, while shadows moved through spaces that should have been empty. Most disturbing were the glimpses of creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time, beings whose forms shifted and changed in ways that hurt to observe directly. The 4 stags that fed upon Yggdrasil's branches, Dain, Dvalin, Dunare, and Durathror, began to behave erratically, sometimes feeding voraciously, as if trying to consume as much of the tree's essence as possible before some approaching catastrophe, other times refusing to eat entirely, standing motionless for days while their eyes reflected a knowledge too terrible for even divine beasts to fully comprehend. Even the cosmic goat Hydron, whose udders had provided endless mead for the heroes of Valhalla, began to produce milk that tasted of ashes and sorrow. The warriors who had once celebrated their eternal battles with goblets raised in toast to glorious death found their drink turning bitter on their tongues, carrying flavors that spoke of endings rather than eternal renewal. The great boar Saehrimnir, whose flesh had fed the Einherjar each day only to be reborn whole for the next feast, began to show signs of corruption. In his meat, dark veins running through what had once been perfect sustenance. And so we reach the end of Fenrir's tale, a story that began with an innocent wolf pup playing in golden halls and transformed into the darkest prophecy of Norse mythology. Through fear and betrayal, the gods created their own destruction, binding not just a creature, but their very fate to an inevitable twilight. As you drift into sleep, let these ancient echoes of destiny remind you that even in darkness, stories endure, carrying their timeless wisdom through the ages until dawn comes again.
If you're still here at the end, thank you for spending this time with me under the night sky of Olympus. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe. More myths are coming, and leave a comment. Which god, hero, or legend should we journey through next?